Bob will be distributing two of several handouts that we will use tonight and tomorrow. Sunday morning we will be doing a slightly different thing where we raise some questions about discipleship in the digital era. And so that will be different than what we're doing with worship here tonight and tomorrow. But I'm hoping that the several handouts taken together will be analogous to the way the four Gospels testify to Christ. Each one of them by itself may still leave some questions unanswered, but the group together, we hope, coalesces into a composite picture that makes some sense. And that's my hope for our sessions together. One of the reasons I'm using handouts is I found that we can cover more material if we simply dodge around in there, and the more self-explanatory parts leave with less comment, and the ones that may be less so with more comment. And so don't panic if on any given session, 10 minutes before we finish, it looks like I'm only halfway done. That doesn't mean I'm going to race through all the rest of it. We will leave some of it, and we may even overlap sessions from time to time. That's fine. We'll do the best we can. If you'll start with this landscape-oriented handout, the one-page handout that Bob sent around, different biblical ways of looking at the 3 or 4 moments in human history and how they are reenacted in Christian worship. That sort of sets the framework for what I'd like to do with you tonight and tomorrow, and that's why I want to spend a little time chatting with you about this. And so if you don't have one, make sure you raise your hand and get one of those. When I first started studying worship fairly seriously, roughly 30 years ago, Jeff, to teach the course on Presbyterian government and worship, probably a quarter of it on government and 3/4 on worship would be my recollection of that. One of the things I noticed as someone trained in Bible, with a PhD in biblical studies, is that the term worship is actually comparatively rare in the Bible. The term that we use for our gatherings on the first day of the week, worship, is actually fairly rarely used, and when it is used, it even more rarely refers to Christian assemblies on the first day of the week. Quite often it refers to idolatrous worship. That's kind of a bummer. So what we actually find is our convention of using the word worship to describe what we do on the day that Christ was raised is a fairly new convention, and it wasn't the convention the Bible used. Now, that's not just a fun, interesting historical fact. The reason I say it is this. The way I normally start studying anything is with a concordance. Now, today the concordances tend to be digital, and they used to be books. But one of the things we do if we're studying a thing in the Bible is we want to see, well, where does the Bible address this thing? The concordance doesn't give you an exhaustive answer because there are synonyms in every language, and so to understand a thing, you might have to look up its synonyms also. What I found is you don't learn much about worship from the Holy Scriptures by searching for the word worship. The term is used for idolatrous worship. It's used figuratively for the entirety of Christian life in Romans 12:1 and 2, for instance. And so that intrigued me, and I started looking around and eventually found other answers to the question. The Bible normally refers to it as a gathering or a meeting or an assembly. What we call worship is ordinarily designated by another term in Holy Scripture. And to help you see that, the purpose of this little handout is to help you realize that there are at least 5 different ways of talking about the 3 or 4, if you wish, great moments in human history. In our theological circles, we use the one at the top, creation, fall, redemption. It's the most common way that we speak of the whole sweep of human history. Creation, in the image of God with the mandate to rule the world, the rebellious fall from that position, and then God through Christ restoring that or redeeming us from that lost condition. Now, if you're Thomas Boston, you divide the third part into 2. Redemption begun now and redemption consummated at the return of Christ. That's fine if you wish to do that. Everyone agrees that Boston was right to say that. So you can put an asterisk there if you wish. But many of us just say creation, fall, redemption. The same realities, however, can also be designated in other ways. And when you designate them in other ways biblically, you see them differently than if you only designate them this way. We see this, for instance, in our houses, where we have the formal given names of our children when they were baptized. But then we have other shorthand names, we sometimes call them, and then things like Pookie or Biff, right? We have all sorts of other things, right? Or Sweetie Pie, right? We have other ways of labeling what is referentially the same thing, and sometimes each of those labels tells us something that the other one didn't. And so what I would like to suggest also is there are these four other ways of dealing with the matter. The one that will occupy us the most is the second of those triads. The presence of God, banishment from God, and the presence of God restored. But there are others also that I want to help you see, because these are our Pookies and Biffs and other kinds of ways of doing it. We can also, speaking of the human, that the human was united in creation as one family. And then, when we became rebellious, we were scattered, especially at the Tower of Babel. And God deliberately scattered us, using the same term normally used for the sowing of seeds when someone's out sparrow and diasparo, tossing things around like that. And then humans will be gathered again. This begins at Pentecost, when the diaspora Jews are brought back in from all sorts of places and hear the good news being spoken to them, it says, in their own language or dialects. And then that itself is given further expression in Revelation 7, when John looks forward to the redeemed state, and he says, I saw a multitude whom no man could number, from every tongue and tribe and nation, falling down before the throne and before the Lamb, and saying, Worthy is the Lamb who was slain to receive all these things. So the human, made to be united as one great family, Adam's family, by our rebellion, not only are banished from God's presence, your second set of triads, but our human fabric is dissolved by sin. We are scattered and separated and speak different languages. And redemption in the Bible is also thought of as the restoration of the human race to its original created integrity as one holy family, about which we will not have time to say much this weekend. A fourth way of speaking of these three same moments is God's rule, our insurrection or revolt or rebellion, and His suppression of that and the restoration of His rule. And so in our present day, we live as insurrectionists. We are those who rebel and revolt against God's order. And then the pledge of redemption is that God would restore that order. One of the concluding lines of one of our hymns, "'Tis well for us He ruleth." 'Tis well for us He ruleth, right? To be ruled by unruly humans is not well for us. To be ruled by the God who made us, who knows our frame and that we are only dust, 'tis well for us He ruleth. And so we long for that. And of course, when Jesus and the Baptist appears, it's perfectly evident that this is what they're doing. Because in the great comprehensive introduction to Jesus' public ministry in Matthew 4:17, from this time on, Jesus began to preach and to say, the kingdom of God is at hand. It is not the most popular verse among United States Christians. There's this little problem we had with George III in the late 18th century. And we replaced a king with a president. So we don't really like the language of kings and kingdoms here in our republic too much. And yet it's the consistent language of Jesus in His proclamation. This poor, horribly unruly, divided group of knuckleheads is about to experience God's reign again. The kingdom is there. And just think of the introduction to almost all of the parables that have an introduction. The kingdom of God is like. The kingdom of God is like. The rule of God is like this. The reign of God is like this. The language of God restoring His reign is all over the Gospels. It's just not native to American ears to like that language very much. Well, in the next life, take it up with the evangelists If you've got a beef with Matthew, Mark, and Luke, have a beef with them. Don't shoot the messenger, right? I'm just saying what they say. So one way of thinking of the great moments of creation, fall, and redemption, there was this beautiful order, ordered and ruled by a benevolent and majestic God. And then we revolted against that order and suffered the consequences. And then we have this lovely pledge that at one point, God will restore his good order again. And every knee will bow to his reign in that moment. And then if you want to think on a more personal and moral nature, we can think of these triads as primitive integrity, the original integrity of Adam, entire depravity, by which we don't mean that we're as depraved as we possibly could be, but that the entirety of our human nature is now depraved. And then we have the begun recovery through the work of the Holy Spirit now, and the consummated recovery of the image of God in the life to come. But for our purposes, our focus tonight, tomorrow, is the second of those sets of triads, the presence of God, banishment from God, and the presence of God restored. And what I will suggest then is that what you and I ordinarily and conventionally call worship is a pageant. It's a pageant in which the human history strains towards its consummated future, where the human who once dwelt in the blessedness of God's presence was then banished, and the cherubim with flaming swords prevented our re-entry to that presence. We have this pledge that we will be invited back to his presence again. That those who bear Adam's nature will actually be readmitted to the paradisical presence of God. And of course, the breakthrough moment is the ascension. One of the reasons we don't talk much about the ascension is we don't get it. The ascension only makes sense in terms of Genesis 3. It's the reversal of the cursed banishment of Genesis 3, where those who bear Adam's nature are banished from God's presence. The ascension of Christ after his resurrection is the first of Adam's race with full human flesh to go back into that paradisical presence as bearer of God's image. And all of our worship is our re-entering the presence of God as an earthly picture of that heavenly estate. We call it worship, but what it really is a meeting between God and his once banished people, who through the perfect obedience and sacrifice of Christ are readmitted by union with him in some small foretaste way to the presence of God again. And so we enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. We actually enter into his presence. And many of our liturgies over the years have historically begun with two parts, have they not? A call to worship. Because who are we as once banished people to enter the presence of God? And the call to worship from some biblical text says to those who are redeemed, through the redemptive work of the reconciling Christ, you are readmitted. And we now call you to reverse, as it were, at least in pageant, that reality. And after the call to worship, we ordinarily have an invocation, which is not a general term for prayer. Invocation is a technical term for the invoking of God's divine presence, where he, having called us through his word to meet him, we now ask him to return the favor. We invoke his presence so that we might meet with him. What we call worship is a meeting with God that is an earthly pageant of the heavenly reality, a temporal pageant of an eternal reality. As once banished, rebellious creatures re-enter the presence of God, whom to know is life eternal. And so it is that second one that we really wish to focus on in our comments together. And so what happens in our what we call worship is a picture that the cursed banishment will one day be overcome. We might even say that all of worship is sacramental with a small s. If a sacrament ordinarily is a visible or tangible representation of some other truth, everything we do once we leave our ordinary and profane activities, our regular secular activities, everything we do on that first day when we gather is itself a picture of Revelation 7, when God will gather people from every tongue, tribe, and nation, and they will fall before His presence in glad worship. The whole event is that. So not merely baptism and not merely the supper, but the whole event with a small s is a sacramental pageant in which what we see and witness is itself, in some sense, the reality that we wish to experience. The whole of the heavenly estate, according to Revelation 21, is in fact this reality, that God will be their God. He will dwell with them. It says, "Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man, and God Himself will be with them." That is our everlasting state. The once banished children of Adam will be brought back into His presence in that estate, and that is what the full nature of reality will be. And we have several texts which help us to see that that's in fact what's going on. Now, we couldn't do this, of course, without the reconciling work of God in Christ. We can't go barging back into the garden, even with the help of the best realtor and their best slogan, location, 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 right? Yes, the presence of God, the presence of God, the presence of God is the best location. But our realtors can't take us there. Only the reconciling Christ can take us there. And so we do not meet God directly, but indirectly through the work of Christ and by our union with Him. We do not go into His presence unreconciled. We go into God's presence by union with Christ and the reconciliation that is ours in Him. So worship is this kind of a pageant. And when we gather, that's what we are doing. We are gathering together, as we will see, to reverse the horrible realities of Genesis 3. So many of us think of Genesis 3 as the curse, because the curses are articulated. Cursed is the ground because of you. On your belly you will go, cursed in childbearing, and so forth. The thorns and thistles and so forth. There are curses there, but it's also a banishment. And the cherubim are placed there with not only swords, but flaming swords. So the swords are fiery to prevent the human from going back and grasping the tree of life. And the same Moses who writes Genesis 3 and then writes the other 4 books of the Pentateuch, the same Moses, if you check this on one of your digital or book computers, concordances, you'll find that the next time the word cherubim appears after Genesis 3 is in the instructions for the tabernacle. It's the next time the word appears. Because 11 tribes of the Israelites cannot go into the holy place. One tribe can. And they make these curtains, scarlet curtains and blue and purple. And woven into them are cherubim, to remind that they are still banished from God's holy presence, and only by His special selection of the sons of Phinehas can one tribe go a little further in. And then once a year, there's another curtain separating the holy place from the Holy of Holies, and only one person, the high priest, once a year is permitted to pass through those curtains, and woven into them is the cherubim. And when this one person, a representative of the tribe that was a representative of the 12 tribes that was representative of the human race, that one individual, when he finally passes through the second curtain and the second set of cherubim, there carved into the Ark of the Covenant is a third set of cherubim with their burning swords. Even in the picture, therefore, of our re-entering the presence of God, through the Israelites as a microcosm of humanity, the Levites as a microcosm of Israel, and the high priest as a microcosm of the Levites, even then, we are reminded 3 times that the cherubims still protect the holy presence of God from the unholy. And only by a picture do we see a small pageant that promises that one day Adam's race will pass through the flaming swords again and enter into the presence of God. And so some generations understood this better. They were more familiar with God's holiness and recognized that we were unholy. And then we got into I'm okay and you're okay. We're not so sure about Bob. The rest of us, I'm okay and you're okay. And we sort of lost the sense. And for us now, it's the gates of paradise are open. Just enter whenever you wish. But we have a great deal of biblical instruction telling us, no, we cannot do this unreconciled. The holy and the unholy will not mix and cannot mix. And so something has to be done to deal with it. So the second of your outlines, the one that's printed in normal vertical direction, is a quick romp through what I would call a biblical theology of meeting with God. If we think of biblical theology, not merely as theology that's biblical versus unbiblical, but biblical arranged in the chronological order that the Bible is arranged in, what I would like to suggest is that we can just kind of glimpse at this now and then field some questions about it and see that throughout the progress of Revelation, the question of banishment and the undoing of banishment is a recurring reality in the Holy Scriptures. So what we find then is that the Bible constantly refers to our assemblies. If I were the devil, no comments please, if I were the devil, I would love to have religious people use religious words to talk about religion rather than everyday words. Because remember that the Greek and the Hebrew in which the Holy Scriptures were written existed before there were religious needs for them. And the words used in almost every case also had a secular common use. And we sometimes forget what they actually mean because we only use them in a religious way. Church is just a derivative of the Latin adjective kuriakos, something belonging to kurios, the Lord. In Greek, the ordinary word that we translate church, ecclesia, is just the most common word for a public assembly. In fact, when there's a question of whether to arrest the apostles or not, and someone's wondering if a formal charge should be read, they said, well, the assembly is sitting, right? Bring a charge. When I was in 1970, as a young man, when I was a page in the Virginia legislature, now my mother was a little tart at times, I suppose, and she said I was merely a paragraph, but I was hired to be a page. When I worked with the Virginia legislature in 1970, it was called the General Assembly of the Commonwealth of Virginia, because it was a public assembly of those who passed laws, right, with the help of some small people like us who ran around to committees and did things for them. So assembly is a perfectly common term used in both Greek and English to designate some public gathering for some important public purpose. But we call it church, a term that has no corresponding secular usage, and so after a while we don't even know what it means other than the thing we do every week. But if we could do the Keanu Reeves trick with the back of the head and put a chip in there, so that whenever we tried to say church, we couldn't do it. Assembly, right, came out, right? If we did that, we would immediately say, why do we call this an assembly? And the answer is, the Virginia legislature assembled to write laws. We assemble to meet God. It's an assembly to meet God. And it goes back to the Old Testament language of the various assemblies there. The Israelites did not assemble at the foot of Mount Sinai to meet other Israelites. They already knew one another. They assembled at the foot of Mount Sinai to meet Yahweh. And by the way, they were terrified. Talk about holy. What's worse, cherubim with flaming swords, or thunder and lightning, and the whole place quaking and shaking? Right? It's terrifying. Because there's a holy God on this holy hill and unholy people standing at the bottom, and oil and water don't mix well, and they didn't on that day. And of course, what does Moses call that day many times? The day of assembly. The day of assembly. So in Hebrew usage, even more so than in secular usage, assembly now is a public assembly of a religious nature where God's people assembled in his presence. And so when the apostles just casually toss out the term assembly to refer to what we do, that's the background to it. That's what they're talking about. So we are originally present with God in the garden. We met God, our Creator, on the sixth day when we, through Adam, were made. And note that when God makes a creature that he calls his image, he speaks to it. And he speaks blessing to it. Did you notice that around verse 28, 29? And he blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply. That the God who later cursed them originally meets with them and speaks blessings to them. He also blessed and sanctified the Sabbath. He blessed the seventh day. He did not bless the other six. He blessed the seventh day and made it holy, a day in which they would especially celebrate their relation to their Maker. And then he spoke generously. He spoke blessings. He spoke generously to the creature, you may freely eat of every tree from the garden. There's only this one that you can't. But you may freely eat of every tree. It's a generous, blessing relationship that is established, and it is communion because God is constantly communing and speaking with the creature made in his image. And then he gave to that creature's perfect complement. This, alas, is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. So he blesses him with nourishment, blesses him with his own presence, blesses him with the Sabbath, and blesses him with a perfect complement. So you see what happens? There is this juxtaposition between the presence of God and rich blessing. Just as later in chapter 3, there's the juxtaposition of the absence, the banishment, with cursing. So banishment and cursing go together, presence and blessing go together. That's why I say, whom to know is life eternal. Because to be in the presence of God, to know him, to commune with him, is the highest form of human life. And so the human in the created order revels in the blessedness of his estate as the highest of God's earthly creatures, perfectly equipped with his task with a worthy mate, delighting in one another, delighting in the garden, which is not only nourishing, it's pleasing to the eye and good for food. It is both lovely and life-sustaining, both beautiful and practical. God is both artist and artisan. The place is just rich. It's just rich and wonderful. I've been rereading Paradise Lost the last couple of weeks again. And if you're not like me on that score, do it every 7 or 8 years. Treat yourself and read it again. It's just wonderful. And around books 5 and 6, you get to the section where Satan has left his arena and is going up there to observe this newly created being, the man and his wife, to try to take them away from all their blessedness. And the picture of the original created state that Milton presents in words almost makes you weep. The relation of Adam and Eve as they have their daily worship of the God who gave them such a rich environment and one another is one of the richest pictures in all literature. It's wonderfully, wonderfully done. And of course, he teases out the whole of the Genesis narrative into 10 or 12 books instead of just 3 chapters. And so he amplifies at every point. But the sections there in chapters 5 and 6 are almost breathtakingly charming and lovely as we have this richer expression of the relation of the original created order, basking in the presence of God, basking in the created order around them, and basking in one another's company. It's a lovely, lovely picture at that time, because it really is just a wonderful thing. And if we move too quickly through it, if we're doing our Bible laps, how many chapters can I read this week? If we're doing that, and we move too quickly through chapters 1 and 2, we fail to feel the weight of how glorious it was for them to have been created in the presence of God, to have communed with him and with one another as they did. And if we have to, we can either read it 5, 6, 7 times, or let Milton help us, or do what I do when I'm reading Milton, to appreciate poetry, and you can do this with the Bible also. I think I wrote 240 lines of book 3 into 8.5 by 11 pages. It took me 2 nights to do it. But you really notice a poem when you write it out, especially if there's enjambment, and Milton has lots of enjambments in the lines where he ends them, not at the end of the clause and so forth. You can do the same thing with Holy Scripture. If you took your time with just the 6th day of creation in Genesis 1, through the first 13 or 14 verses, 15 verses of chapter 2, and wrote them several times, you would notice things that you don't notice when you're scanning. A scanning generation scans for information, cut to the chase, let me have the high spots. Milton does just the opposite. He takes hundreds and hundreds of lines to say what Moses said in one. And so you get this richer and fuller picture of the blessedness of the original created order. And then, in Genesis 3, the curse banishment, where the human revolts against God's good order. Surrounded by all this wonderful vegetation that pleases the senses and is delightful for practical purposes and nourishment, there's only one that we're prohibited from enjoying, and we insist on having that one. And so God's judgment at that point is the first of many subsequent acts of judgment against Israel or others in Holy Scripture, and tends to be similar in kind. Most judgment in Holy Scripture is ironic. I wouldn't say all of it, but most of it is. So God says, oh, you'd rather have the counsel of the serpent, the creature, than the Creator? I'll let you go to that. I'll turn you loose to an environment where I'm not there to bother you. And there you can have the serpent's counsel, right? Have it your way. You don't like my ordering of things? Fine. Have thousands of years of disorder, right? You don't wish to regard my created order with respect? Fine. Pave paradise. Put up a parking lot. Tear the thing all to pieces, right? The whole thing is ironic, and it's almost all that way all the way through the Holy Scriptures, that God effectively gives us what our sinful heart wants. My doctoral advisor, when he was writing his commentary on Romans, Paul Ochtermeyer, said at one point, according to Genesis 3 and Romans 1, the penalty for sin is sin. 3 times in Romans 1, verses 24, 26, and 28, I think it is, Paul says, paradic, and he handed them over. He handed them over. He handed them over. You want a debased mind? I'll hand you over to a debased mind. You want impure thoughts? I'll abandon you to them. And so all of that goes back to the Genesis 3 narrative, where the human who says, no, we don't want your counsel and your order. We want the serpent's counsel and his order. And he says, fine. And I'll just bar you from having this troublesome order of mine. Out you go and have it your way, right? And so that's what happens in the curse banishment. He drove out the man, and at the east of the Garden of Eden, he placed the cherubim and a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. And so off the human race goes. Genesis 11, if I'm not mistaken, should then be understood at the Tower of Babel is an attempt to storm heaven. After Genesis 3, the heavens and the earth, which were already, from Genesis 1:1, 2 different arenas, but even there, I think the heavenly arena before the fall was the higher and more ideal, because the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, whereas the heavenly was always the ideal, even before the other one was fallen. But afterwards, the chasm between them grows. It's this much greater thing. And so the one is this holy realm filled with life and light, and the other is this incredibly unholy realm. And so what happens in Genesis 11 is there's this awareness that the arena above, that's where the good stuff is, right? And so they try to storm heaven, right? They build a tower and try to get there on their own. And of course, God will not let them do it, and he comes down and destroys the tower, and even confounds their languages, lest they get together and plan a similar event next time. At least now, the French will have to learn to speak German first, and the Germans will have to speak English or something approximating it, and they'll all have to get together and get their translators. I always think about this, unfortunately, when I see the UN on television. Right? They're collaborators, and they have to have interpreters to help them collaborate. And sometimes I think what they do is kind of like Babel, sort of storming heaven and trying to create a perfect arena here on earth, kind of a thing. So God will have nothing to do it, and he scatters them. So notice the language of scattering in Genesis 11. Let us go down, and they're confused their language. Just verse 7 of chapter 11. Confuse their language so that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. Putz in Hebrew is even stronger than diaspero in Greek, but it's the same verb in each case. Putz is in both verses dispersed, and in the Greek translation it's diaspero in each case also. Diaspero can be a perfectly neutral term, like the sowing of seed. A sower went out to sow. But if you look at putz in the Hebrew text of the Old Testament, it's a harsher term. It shows for the first time in the judicial language of Numbers 10:35, but you will immediately recognize it as appearing again in several of the Psalms. Arise, O Lord, and let your enemies be scattered. Let your enemies be scattered is the language of Numbers 10:35 as they pray for Yahweh's military help. Let your enemies be scattered. And you recall how that appears in several of the Psalms. Handel, I think, even put them to music in the Cantos anthems on one or two occasions. Let the enemies be scattered. And so scattering, you see, is this form of judgment. Sending them out, dividing them, lest in their unity they revolt against God's words. And so it's a way of trying to retard human malpractice by separating them, scattering them. So it's harder for them now to join together in cooperative endeavors because so many of those endeavors are hostile to the order of God. And so he sends them off, confuses their language, and dispersed them or scattered them over the face of all the earth. Right. And the reversal of that at Pentecost and the reversal of that in Revelation 7, every tongue, tribe, nation brought back together, reconciled, and now safely cooperating and singing adoration of God. And so when we gather, we're not yet perfected, but we put aside our other concerns and join our hearts and voices together to sing the praise of God. It's as close as you get to heaven on earth. That's what it is. It's the little antechamber to heaven. When we gather, formally dispersed through the week to our respective jobs and responsibilities, and then we come into a common location, picturing Revelation 7, and we join voices in the adoration of God. And so it's this great pageant, a remarkable pageant that anticipates the life to come. And so what we call redemption, then, we might say, is a return to God's presence, which through the mediation of Christ we are invited to do on the first day of the week. That the apostles called the saints together. Jesus himself said to wait in Jerusalem until he descended at Pentecost and so forth through the Spirit. And so now what happens is what we call worship is a pageant that is a picture of the reversal of the curse banishment. Now the dispersed and scattered people, tossed to the wind like seed, return together and offer together their adoration of a worthy deity. That's what we're actually doing. In the patriarchal era, we see some glimpses of this reversal also, with the smoking fire pot and flaming torch of Genesis 15, and walking through it, and some stuff's not being consumed and other things are. A crazy epiphany, a strange event, and then a voice from it, right? A covenant that Yahweh makes with Abram, to your offspring I give this land from the river of Egypt to this, and so forth. Remarkable thing. And then there's the appearance in Genesis 18 of the three curious men that Abram bumps into. Strange kind of creatures, wondering what they are. A promise and so forth that would happen. And of course, Jacob's is wonderful in chapter 28, isn't it? Jacob's is the patient, appropriate, faithful version of Genesis 11. Genesis 11 pictures rebellious humanity storming heaven, taking it by force if it could. In Genesis 28, Jacob just sleeps. He rests. And in his rest, he has the dream of all dreams, doesn't he? Right? He has the best dream that anyone ever had. Not a ziggurat, which is probably what the Tower of Babel was, more like a pyramid, a big mound. They didn't have steel reinforced concrete and so forth. It wasn't like that. He saw some other things stretching between heaven and earth. And now the angelic beings that normally dwell there, away from our place, he sees this structure between heaven and earth and the angels of God ascending and descending on it, just going up and down. They can freely go either way. Like opening the interstate for a day, closing off all the on-ramps, and saying, Bob, you can go 2 miles north and turn your car around and come 2 miles south on the same road if you want. Just back and forth and back and forth. And so there they go. And for Jacob, he sees this, and it's an amazing thing to him. Right? Just the idea that the angelic beings who surround God, who ever live in his blessed presence, might come down and maybe bring a shadow of that presence with them. And then maybe if they go back up, we could sneak in behind them. Right? It's a neat dream that he has. It's a really, really fascinating thing. And so I'm the Lord, the God of Abram, right? The voice comes out and so forth. The offering would be this, that, and the other. And when Jacob awoke from his sleep, he said, surely the Lord is in this place. Which no one had said since Adam was in the garden. Surely the Lord is in this place. We've been banished from the Lord. Surely the Lord is in this place, and I didn't know it. And he was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. Bethel. This is the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. This is the house. So later when Paul says, that you may know how to carry yourselves in the house of God, long before you have tabernacle or temple, you have Jacob, the house of God. Why is it the house of God? Because briefly, through the epiphany of the angels, the presence of God comes to earth again. And we have a foretaste of reconciliation between heaven and earth. A way that heaven can connect to earth, earth connect to heaven. The holy realm somehow manages to rescue the unholy. The realm of blessedness comes down to the realm of cursing and pulls it back towards itself. Like a yo-yo on a string. It's the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. And then that particular picture, pretty much disappears until it shows up most cryptically in the first chapter of the fourth gospel. Jesus sees Nathanael coming after this talking with Philip, and he calls him by name. And Nathanael says, this is amazing. He says, well, I saw you under the fig tree over there with Philip. Wow, you must be the Son of God. And Jesus, that's nothing. You think that's nothing. You will see the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. So now it's word for word from the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Absolutely word for word, angels of God ascending and descending, but now not on it, on the ladder, but on the Son of Man. Christ will restore the fellowship between heaven and earth. He will recreate Beit El, the house of God. And just as Jacob said in his dream, this is it. This is the house of God. God's present here. So also in the incarnate Christ, God is present, right? And so now heaven has come to earth, and the angels of God are reviving Jacob's dream. Nathanael gets to see what Jacob dreamt of, something that will restore the fellowship of heaven and earth. And Jesus tosses it out there without any word of explanation. So that many times, if you're like me, you read it many times and never caught the allusion to Genesis 28. You could just go right past it. But then if you look at it, it's word for word, and it seems to be an intentional allusion. Some of your study Bibles even will put a reference in there because they think also that it was an intentional reference, as the incarnate Christ now outdoes Jacob's dream, right? And gives him even more. This is the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. And then you have the wrestler, right? You have the wrestler in Genesis also. The patriarchs had all these crazy encounters with angelic beings that were visitors from the heavenly arena, as it were, coming down here and so forth. That is, even in the state of our being banished, Somebody or the other keeps getting this vision every now and then that maybe the abandonment is not forever. Maybe the banishment is temporary. Maybe one day we will again consort with the heavenly beings and their heavenly realm and the most heavenly God. And so these little events, and they're really curious, aren't they? They are really strange. But to those who encountered them, they were pledges that these two once banished and separated arenas would not remain separate forever. And so this is what happens. What was Jacob's response to the wrestling? I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been delivered. Right? He's wrestling with this curious creature, his hips thrown out of joint, and he doesn't say, wow, that hip hurts, right? Or that guy's awful good with his full Nelson, right? Right? He says, for I have seen God face to face. Right? I have seen God. Right? So some traditions talk more about the beatific vision than ours does, I suppose, but they're onto something, right? That what the human longs for is to see God, to bask again in His presence as Adam and Eve did in the state of innocence. We wish to have the innocence necessary to find it a blessing, of course, but we wish to bask in His presence. Lewis, constantly said this in his writings. He said it's not when things are going wrong that we have a profound sense of longing. It's when they go right. And he used the German word Sehnsucht for it again and again. And he says it's when you do get the job you've wanted for 6 years that on your way home, part of you says, boy, my wife's going to be happy about this. And another part, you're not as happy as you thought you should have been. The first child is born. It's the best thing that's ever happened. You still feel like something might be missing, right? It's your wedding day, and your bride is walking down the aisle. This is the best day of my life. And you still feel like something's missing, Lewis. Lewis said it was precisely in those moments where this realm, this cursed, banished realm, gives you the best it can offer you, and you still feel like something is missing. And he said it's because our soul was restless, as Augustine says, until it rests in God. And we are dissatisfied until we see Him face to face, until the dwelling place of God is with man. And so this earth cannot ever satisfy us entirely. And even when it comes closest, we still know we're missing something. Even if we can't put our finger on it, Lewis says, that's what it is. We want to see God. We want to behold Him and all of His glorious and holy love. As Jacob said, I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been delivered. The sword did not sever head from torso. Wounded. He was wounded. But the sword did not cut his head off. His life was delivered, though he'd had this image of God. And of course, later, we'll chat about this some tomorrow, we'll chat some about the tabernacle and later the temple as the house of God. The place where Yahweh dwelt, where His Shekinah was, where His covenant tablets were, where the Ark of the Covenant was, where the Levitical priests were. And that was the place where God could be met and not anywhere else. That's just where it was. He could have selected anywhere in the entire created order, covenanted with any particular people, but He chose the Israelites there, and they built the tabernacle according to the specifications, and they didn't consult with one another as to how they wanted it done. Right? Instead, there were these rich, detailed explanations of how it had to be done, and that was the place where if you wanted to get a glimpse of God, you had to go. But most of the tribes had to kind of stand outside in the outer court and watch the Levites go through the curtain and think, man, wouldn't it be neat to go through that curtain? And we hear there's another curtain that this other guy goes through once a year. Wouldn't that be neat? Right? And so the whole thing pictured, what would it be like if we could get past the cherubim with their sword? Wouldn't that be the coolest thing? And so later you'll see tomorrow that I often call the tent of meeting. It's called the tent of meeting 142 times in the Old Testament. It's really the tent of non-meeting, isn't it? Right? It's only one person once a year who gets close. And even then, it's not God. It's just the tablets of the covenant and the Ark of the Covenant. And the rest of the Levites are outside on the other side of the curtain. And the other 11 tribes of the Israelites are on the other side of the other curtain. And so it's really more the tent of non-meeting than the tent of meeting, because it is just a picture of our eventual meeting with God in the life to come. And so in that particular moment, it emphasized more that reconciliation had not yet occurred and that the cherubim were still doing their job, right? The ninjas of the garden. There they are guarding the place, and we couldn't get past them. They were doing their thing to keep us out. And so it is the house of God insofar as there is a house of God on earth during that era. But it's still a house in which we don't have an open house. There were no open houses in the tabernacle. All 12 tribes, come on in. It's July the 4th, right? We're having a sale. That just never happened. Only the high priest, once a year. So it was a tent as much of non-meeting, we might say, as meeting. And then note that the New Testament assemblies are often designated by the same term as the tabernacle and later temple. There are several places that Hebrews 3:2, who is faithful to him who appointed him, just as Moses also was faithful in all God's house. But Christ also was faithful to that sort of thing. When you come together, the language of gathering, we also come together. Christ is faithful over God's house as a son. And we are his house, if indeed we hold fast our confidence and our boasting and our hope. We are God's house. Because insofar as he meets people on earth now, it is not in the tabernacle in Jerusalem or the temple there. Insofar as he is to be met on earth, it is in the apostolic assemblies on the first day of the week. And we are his house. This is where God is to be found. It's kind of a curious thing. If we wanted a refrigerator, I suppose we'd go to an appliance store. If we wanted to purchase an automobile, I suspect we'd go to an automobile salesman. It's curious to me that many people say, well, I'm not sure I've really found God yet. I won't go to church until I find God. And, well, if you're going to find God, that's where you're going to find him. Right? That's his house. If it's the presence of God you're looking for, you have to go to where he's pledged his presence, because he hasn't pledged it at the refrigerator store or at the auto store. That's not where it is. Paul says, do you not know you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? What agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God. As God said, I will make my dwelling among them and walk among them, and will be their God, and they will be my people. In Ephesians 2, Paul says, you are being built together into a dwelling place for God by the Spirit. Again and again and again, the apostolic testimony is the role played by the tabernacle and later temple in the Old Testament is now played by the New Covenant assemblies. And remember, at this time, they hadn't been there long enough to build buildings. They met in somebody's house one week, might have met outside in the agora on another, but there wasn't a building that was designated that. It was the gathering that was designated in these texts as the house or temple of God. If I delay, 1 Timothy 3, you may know how one ought to behave in the house of God. ESV says household, but it's oiko. It's just house. The house of God, which is the church of the living God, a pillar and buttress of the truth. The assembly of the living God is the house of God now. That's where he is to be found, if at all. And so many of the gatherings of the New Testament church are also called synagogues in the original, even though it's not an Old Testament institution. There were many Jews who gathered in the first century in synagogues, and the term appears very often, and on occasion that term appears as a reference to Christian assemblies. But even more common is just the word come together, sun erchomai in Greek, often used for the Christian assemblies as the place where we gather the way the Israelites did at the foot of Sinai. When you come together, it is not for better, 1 Corinthians 11. They did come together, but in that case they did horrible things. And Paul said it was even worse. When you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper that you eat, because they're fouling the whole thing up. So, brothers, when you come together to eat, later in that chapter, wait for one another so that it will not be for judgment. This kind of language is used routinely. And as I suggested a moment ago, at Sinai you have this too, especially. It's a meeting with God that takes place there. I suppose it's the most remarkable of the epiphanies or theophanies in the Old Testament. Ezekiel's is pretty remarkable too, but you don't have a whole crowd of people there. So I think at Mount Horeb you have the most remarkable thing. Big hill quaking and shaking, thunder and lightning, all sorts of stuff. Animals, if they get too close, will die. It's an enormous tempestuous scene, and the Israelites gathered at the foot, at the bottom. A most remarkable thing. And it is a meeting, but recall that at Sinai, God has not yet been reconciled. Christ has not yet appeared to bear the judgment that the unholy ought to receive from the holy. And so what happens at Sinai is God appears unreconciled. And so that's why all the noise, all the racket, and why the whole thing is so frightening at that point. In chapter 9 of Deuteronomy, the Lord gave me the 2 tablets of stone written with the finger of God, and on them were all the words that the Lord had spoken with you on the mountain, out of the midst of fire, out of the midst of fire, on the day of assembly, on the day of assembly, in the Greek translation, ekklesia. In chapter 10, he wrote on the tablets in the same writing as before, the 10 words that the Lord had spoken to you on the mountain, out of the midst of the fire, on the first day of the assembly. Out of the midst of fire on the day of assembly. That language repeated several times in the Deuteronomic literature because the whole Sinai revelation was really terrifying with all of the fire that was there. And the New Covenant people, we are in some places referred to then as the assembly of the Lord. And the earliest language goes back to Sinai when the people of the Lord assembled at the foot of the mountain and Yahweh appeared. Even though he appeared in a frightening form, there was at least a kind of a meeting at that point. So the tent of meeting as it comes along then suggests that we are now meeting with God. And it appears again and again and again. Tomorrow I want to chat about some of the details about that and how they can help us to understand it. But you see what happens after the banishment and after the failed effort to storm heaven, you have several meetings of angelic kind of strange beings wrestling with and other kind of thing people. Pledging, a meeting with God will happen again. Jacob has a dream that will happen. At Sinai, God comes down still unreconciled and furious, but he hasn't abandoned us forever, right? He's still covenanting and still pledging and so forth. He makes a house where at least one person once a year can get pretty close, and one tribe can get a little bit close part of the time and so forth. All of this is a pledge that all is not lost. The sinful, rebellious race is not yet finally and entirely abandoned. It may still be that the dwelling place of God will be with man. And so all of these things, through all of these moments, continue to suggest to us that all is not necessarily lost, that the dwelling of God may be with man again. And of course it does happen eventually. And that's why the cherubim are so prolific in the instructions for the tabernacle. We tend to miss it because when we are candid, we acknowledge that reading those passages is less than fascinating, right? I think early in our marriage, for some reason, at the dinner table at night, we were choosing to do some readings, and we chose either Leviticus or Numbers. Must have been my wife's idea. And at about that time, we had inherited our first cat. I say inherited, it showed up this big at the golf course where I was cutting fairways for the summer at Westminster Seminary. And I was working under one of the tractors one day when my wife came to pick me up, and I was down there on the creeper on my back, maybe changing oil or something. And this little kitten, still so small it was wobbly, this little kitten was under there, apparently fascinated with the engineering. And so I heard my wife's voice, so I slid the creeper out, and I came out looking up. And the little wobbly kitten came out too. And I immediately could tell either we both go home or neither of us, right? But I could tell the kitten was going home. Well, the kitten received royal treatment and was less wobbly after a few weeks. And he even got to where he would sit with us during our devotions after our evening meal. Very pious cat. And one night I was reading from the instructions on the tabernacle from Leviticus. And these kind of curtains and this kind of a thread for the priest. And at some point the cat goes, even the cat sighed. The cat was bored with the reading of Leviticus. All right, so if you can bore a cat, that's pretty good achievement. But among the things that happens, if you're not bored like the cat was, is how often the cherubim show up in those narratives. They're all over it, because at this very house of God where we meet God, we are reminded that He has not yet been finally reconciled. And so there's constant reminder in the building of the tabernacle that the cherubs still guard the holy garden and the holy God who stays there. And that holy God has not yet been reconciled. So even as we have this little foretaste that maybe He will be reconciled and that we will meet with Him, we are very much reminded that the cherubs are still standing guard. They're like the beefeaters in London, right? Those guys are always there. And they don't smile. And the cherubs don't smile either. And they're always there. And they're all over the tabernacle and later the temple. And then when the language of the hill of the Lord appears, that's sort of interesting language also in later Jerusalem and also, because it's reminiscent of Mount Sinai. In the mountain, God's up on top of it. And the language of the hill of the Lord. Let us go up, and we go up to the place where we might find Him there. The hill of the Lord, I think, is a foretaste of our meeting with God again. The hill of the Lord, however, does not have any of the tragedy associated with the Tower of Babel in chapter 11 of Genesis, because the hill of the Lord is a natural hill that God made. It's not a man-made defiance of God. It's a hill that's there, and He chooses to bless it with His presence. And so, fair enough if He chooses to do it. That's okay for Him to do it. And of course, the biggest breakthrough in the meeting with God, biblical theologically, is in the Gospels, right? And you shall call His name Emmanuel, which when being translated means God with us. And you kind of remember vaguely, at least, the first time as a child that story was read, probably during the Christmas season. Didn't it seem odd to you, and His name shall be called Emmanuel, which when translated means God with us? I think we remember thinking, but isn't God everywhere? We thought it was odd that He would be called God with us. But probably because we hadn't thought about it in terms of the cursed banishment of Genesis 3. And so we tried not to raise the question. After all, if you did, Santa Claus may not come. So we just went to bed confused. But obviously we meet God when one part of the Godhead takes on human flesh, our very flesh, right, and enters our arena, bearing the same flesh that Adam had. Right? It's an amazing meeting with God. It's the profoundest of all meetings with God. Many of the critics, of the digital technologies that we'll chat about a little bit on Sunday, including especially Ken Myers, many of the critics is that they are de-incarnate, disincarnate. We end up settling for a communication with a piece of plastic or metal rather than with a human that bears the flesh that Jesus bore. We are contented with a disincarnated communion rather than an incarnated communion. It's a profound paradox that Christ, having dignified our material nature by His incarnation, that we are content with disincarnated communication. It's a strange, strange thing. It's the anti-Emmanuel. Not only is God not with us, we're not even with us. Right? So it's a terrible kind of a mistake, it seems to me. And then notice the special regard Jesus had for God's house. So we not only encounter God in the incarnate Christ and meet Him in some sense there, but He had special regard for the temple, did He not? My wife's least favorite story about Jesus is John 2. She doesn't like it. She likes Jesus. She just doesn't like John 2. In the temple, He found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons and the money changers sitting with them and making a whip of cords. And making a whip of cords, He drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and oxen. And He poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." His disciples remembered, you bet they remembered, his disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." What happened to gentle Jesus, meek and mild? He drove the oxen out. Have you ever tried to move a cow? We tried as kids all the time to try to move them when we were down on the Chesapeake Bay. We threw firecrackers across the fence. We shot them with BB guns, and their tail just a BB gun, right? They were hard to move. Maybe aided with a whip of cords, we could have moved them. And note how much at odds we are with the narrative. It's not just my wife. None of us likes that narrative. We don't even label it correctly. What's our conventional label for this event? The cleansing of the temple. As though Jesus, he got a dust mop. Right? We try to domesticate the event and make it less horrifying. Cleanses the temple. Right? In the vernacular, we'd say something like, Jesus broke bad in the temple. Right? Jesus went postal in the temple, right? He got all nuclear in the temple, or kicked Fanny in the temple, if we can say that on a Friday night. It's an absolutely outrageous, cacophonous kind of a story that is so hard for us to handle in our conventional view of Jesus that we call it cleanses the temple. I don't think any of the people there who were changing the money and went home penniless and couldn't find their ox for 3 weeks. And their wife said, "How'd things go today, honey?" "Well, that temple is certainly as clean." Right? No one would have said that. They would have had an entirely different and more frightening memory of it. But you see what he's doing? He's undoing the work of the first Adam. The first Adam failed in his role long before he ate of the tree. Because remember, in Genesis 2 it says that you are to serve Avad and preserve, guard, keep, shamar, the garden. So as soon as he allows the serpent to come in and tempt his wife, he's already admitted the presence of the unholy into the holy place. And the last Adam says, "No, sir, that's not going to happen on my watch. Right? We're not going to allow the unholy in my Father's house." The last Adam had zeal for the holy dwelling place of God and would not admit the presence of the unholy in it, and he inverts the work of the first Adam. And I think that's why John puts it in chapter 2, by the way, because Matthew and Luke record the temptation narrative at this point, where he obviously is undoing the work of the first Adam. It's a very Adamic temptation. The devil appears to him just as he did to Adam. And so early in Matthew's gospel and Luke's gospel, they present Jesus as the one who will not put up with the serpent. John doesn't mention that story, but instead he has this one, where it also harkens back to the Genesis narrative, and in this case also, the last Adam refuses to permit the first Adam a toehold where he shouldn't have it. And so his zeal for God's house is a proper zeal, because what has he done but come to earth to restore the dwelling place of God with man? And so even the picture of it in Jerusalem has to be preserved in its integrity, because what Jesus has come to do is to reunite the once banished humans to their holy God. And so we have this one little house that shows us that great news to come. He will not allow it to become just a place where you sell things. It's got to be something other than that. And of course, at the Mount of Transfiguration, there's the crazy meeting. It's analogous, I think, to those patriarchal meetings with angels and wrestlers and fiery pots and so forth. It's analogous to that. It's a crazy kind of a heavenly things coming down onto earth and everything radiant and shining. And Peter doesn't get it, of course. So Peter wants to make it a permanent museum of some sort. He's unwilling to allow it to be like Jacob's dream. Just had that one good dream, right? Got to let it go now. No, we can't do a permanent thing, but it's very much like it. A bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud, "This is my beloved Son with whom I'm well pleased. Listen to it." Right? Really, really fascinating sort of a thing. And then the death of Christ is most remarkable. The familiar narrative from Matthew 27 actually mentions, I think, 6 things. after Jesus dies. Jesus cried out again with a loud voice, yielded up his spirit. And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And the earth shook, and the rocks were split. The tombs were opened. Many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. All of these appear to me to be eschatological, things that elsewhere prefigure the final state, right? The general resurrection, the tombs giving up their dead, the whole created order, rocks breaking, a new heavens and new earth emerges, and so forth. All of these remarkable things happen, and the curtain of the temple is torn in two. That part of the temple that kept people away so they couldn't enter the presence of God, it's torn in two. And once that's torn in two, then all the other things that characterize the life to come happen. Once the dwelling place of God is with men, as it were, the curtain is torn, then the dead get life. The very rocks are reordered into another kind of a reality. All sorts of strange things occurring, tombs being opened, bodies of saints coming out of their graves. The whole thing is most remarkable, and they are all reversals of Adam's work, every last one of them. And the whole crazy event begins with the temple curtain being torn in two, symbolic of the fact that there will be a dwelling place of God with men, and something will undo the work of the first Adam. So Jesus then pledges that he will have an assembly also. Upon this rock I will build my assembly. I've got the Keanu Reeves chip going. I can't say ch-ch-ch, so I say assembly. On this rock I will build my assembly. Compared to whose? Compared to Moses. They knew about the day of assembly when they assembled at the foot of Sinai. I'm going to build an assembly too, and I'll do it with these people. So he pledges to do so. And so the Christians, when they meet, they're constantly called assemblies, gatherings, where they come together as God's people to bask in his presence insofar as it can be experienced now through the mediation of the reconciling Christ. And that seems to be what they're aware of, because routinely throughout the New Testament scriptures, they are called gatherings and assemblies as though they're borrowing the language of the earlier era to designate their own assemblies. That's what's going on. So those are very, very common, and that's why they were always present. When they came together to break bread, what a remarkable thing. They came together to break bread. The Lord's Supper was such a central element of what they did, that when they came together on the first day of the week to break bread, it says. So they come together as a common people, and they celebrate what Christ said to do in his memory. And there they meet with him, do they not? And once rebellious sinners bow their knees, he said, do this in remembrance of me. They bow their knees, and they do this in remembrance of him. If rebellion got us into this mess, perhaps submission will help get us out of it, or at least be an element or proof that we're getting out of it, that something's changed now. And so they gather for this very simple kind of a matter. And so the first day of the week is sanctified as the day of the resurrection. They gather on that day because it's a holy day, and they seem to understand that it is a reversal of everything, that it is a remarkable event when Christ is raised on the first day of the week. Some of you are familiar with what Barnabas said about it. We're not sure about the dating of the epistle to Barnabas. It could be as early as AD 70 or 72, maybe as late as the early to mid-90s. We're not exactly sure. But Barnabas has this very interesting comment on Isaiah, where Isaiah had been talking about, your new moons and your feasts have become a burden to me. And Barnabas says, you see what his meaning is, referring to Isaiah? You see what his meaning is? It is not your present Sabbaths that are acceptable, but that Sabbath which I have made. When I have put to rest all things, I will make the beginning of the 8th day, which is the beginning of another world. Therefore also we keep the 8th day for rejoicing, on which Jesus also rose from the dead, and after being manifested, ascended into the heavens. You see, for them, the ascension was a big deal. Reverses the curse, banishment. But notice that Barnabas calls it the 8th day, as though the present world and its 7-day calendar couldn't hold the resurrection. And he calls it the beginning of another world. Right? Now, it's plainly the first day of the week. He's read the Gospels, and he knows it's what we conventionally call the first day. But he calls it the 8th day, which is the beginning of another world. And so he sees it for all of its Genesis reversing potential. The mortality associated with this life is going to give way to life. The banishment is going to give way to the presence of God. Our corruption will give way to sanctification and later to glorification. It's a beginning of a new world. And he calls it the day of our rejoicing. Right? It's not the day of moping. It's the day of rejoicing. He knew nothing of the American Puritan Sabbath mope. He knew of the early church's Sabbath rejoicing on the 8th day, which is the beginning of another world. It's a remarkable passage, it seems to me, because he saw the Christian assemblies far from violating the Sabbath by meeting on the first day rather than the seventh, but fulfilling everything the Sabbath was about. And said it's exactly right to do this. This is the day on which Christ came out of the tomb, and he has hallowed this day by his resurrection. And he even calls it the 8th day. We've got Seventh-day Adventists. Do we have any 8th-day Adventists? It'd be nice to be the first 8th-day Adventists. We could still meet on the first day, but call ourselves that, because it would make the point, I think. Well, the redemptive meetings of the church are always, then I would suggest, eschatological. That what they really are is they are looking forward to the day when the dwelling place of God comes to be with us. And so they are above all meetings with God. If I get a chance at some point to write a book about this, that's the title, Meeting with God, a Biblical Theology of Worship. And would rather that we call it Meeting with God than to call it worship, because that's what it is. It's a pageant in which the once banished human is permitted to see a picture of what it will be like when that's reversed and we go back into the presence of God, whom to know is life eternal. So that's enough to get us started tonight, but I did want to pause to see if there are questions about that brief race, because all I'm suggesting here is if you race across Scripture after Genesis 3, you see one after another of interesting ways that God says to us this banishment is not final and everlasting. There is hope that we will meet again, right? We sometimes say that when we haven't seen someone or a friend and then we disappear at the end of maybe a family holiday or reunion. We will meet again, right? Each of these things is God's way of saying we will meet again, so that we not die in despair that we will never see God again, but we will realize that one day we will be like him, for we will see him as he is. And then that allows us to suffer through the present time when we are less like him than we wish we were, and we do not see him yet in our own flesh. But one day we will. In my flesh I will see God, and you in your flesh will see God, and the dwelling place of God will be with man. So all of these things are great little reminders to us of what's coming, and we should think of our worship that way. Of course, when you get to his presence, what would a servile creature do with the Creator? Worship him, right? Offer him praise and adoration. Of course, that's what we do. But before we even do that, we've met him. And that is essentially what it is. So questions about that? You could add, of course, many details. That's just really the skeleton of it. As you go through the whole history of redemption, from Genesis 3 until Revelation 22, the curse banishment is always moving towards the blessing and presence to overturn those other two things. And so that's why I suggest that creation, fall, redemption is very useful. Lots of different ways of talking about this, but one of them, presence, banishment, presence, right? That it's also a way of arranging the whole of Scripture that is a way of thinking of the general move from one end to the other. Jeff, I can't tell whether they're shy about asking questions or eager to get refreshments. Yeah, the reason I use the word pageant is because pageantry, I suppose in sociological terms, is the term we use for important public events where certain things are done because they have symbolic value. And so we surround those events with more than ordinary dignity, and we tend to repeat certain things in those events because of their symbolic nature. And so I didn't want to use a distinctly theological term, because then we would have to argue about what the term means and confuse people about their ordinary uses. But I think pageant is the best word I can think of at this point, that whether the tabernacle, the temple, or the Christian assembly, what you have is a way of picturing what will happen when the cursed banishment of Genesis 3 gets inverted and turned the other way. That's why I think if a service begins, and I'm not suggesting it has to, some of these can be implicit, but when it begins with a call to worship, calling us to God's presence, and an invocation when we call His presence to ours, something's right off the bat, isn't it? It's very right. But it can be done in other ways. Calvin's Strasbourg service started, "Our help is in the name of the Lord, who made heaven and earth, let us worship God." That will work. But for me, pageant is the term we use for those kinds of things. So that is to say, I think there's more going on than the words of each hymn or each prayer or the sermon. But as our wide angle looks around the room and sees previously banished children of Adam called back into the presence of God, meeting together as the Israelites did at the foot of Sinai, I think that's pageantry too. And I'm urging people to see that. See once scattered people, not scattered. Gospel pulled back to the center of their existence, the true and living God. So everything that's happening about it, I think, has this additional quality of being a picture of the final state, especially if we compare it to Revelation 7 and some of those other texts, right? Because sometimes the one who sits on the throne addresses us. Blessed are those whose robes are washed, and these kinds of things. And then sometimes we address Him in song, in praise. So the whole thing that's going on there is very like the pictures of Revelation. And I think they're little earthly reminders that that day will appear. And probably it helps us when we read Revelation to have worshipped in church before. Because we I think in our mind's eye, we sort of translate the words of the book of Revelation into our experience, which is right to do, I think, in some senses. By the way, if you come up with a better term, I have no investments in pageant. There's no property rights. I haven't filed any papers with Washington, D.C., so there may be better terms to use than pageant.
So when some people call it celebration, it actually changes the emphasis a little, would you say, or no? Like,
it catches, does it not? Barnabas is calling it our rejoicing, and perhaps that's what is intended by it. It may lose some of the dignity of the holiness of God in our yet remaining unholiness. So if it did, Barnabas' rejoicing might be a slightly better term that I think for most ears would preserve that. We don't want to, even in heaven, the perfected saints fall down before the Lamb. And so they have a great sense even there, fully reconciled in the life to come, of the inestimable holiness of God. Not in contradistinction to their sin, which has now been atoned for and wiped away. But He's still this incredible Creator, and they are but creature. And so they are very aware in their perfected state that it is their knee that bows. And so you're right, we're trying to find language to make sure we hold on to that sense of His holiness. It's really remarkable, isn't it, that the sanctified saints in heaven, the glorified saints, all their sin removed, they're still falling down. And we don't even do that. And we're sinners. Right? We're not glorified yet. And we would find that undignified. They are glorified and completely without sin. And they are honored to toss themselves down onto the ground before Him. Milton got it. He has Adam and Eve worshiping on their knees in the garden. And they're not even sinners asking their sins to be forgiven. But they are inferiors to a superior, and they gladly acknowledge His superiority to them. So, yeah, you're right, Marcia. We'd have to keep looking around to find the right language to talk about these things.
Something you just in the churches in general.
Well, most of the students of the West would probably suggest that it's two closely related things chronologically, because the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution happened almost simultaneously. They are very closely related to the late 17th century. And what happens with secularism, of course, the Enlightenment, is there's this attempt by the West to make sense of life without religion. And so insofar as we have become increasingly secularized in the West, then religion per se recedes in importance. And why read a religious poem, right? So people are still reading Wordsworth and Coleridge because they are nature poems and the occasional romantic poem in the non-technical sense. But they're reading a little less of Milton. But as a media ecologist, for me, I think every bit as important as secularism is the Industrial Revolution and technology. Almost all of the European commentators on technological advancements, Herbert Marcuse, Wittgenstein, Jacques Ellul, almost all of them regard technique and technology as fundamentally demonic. The effort, like the Tower of Babel, for the human to find blessedness without depending upon a God. So interestingly, even some of the semi-secular Western European interpreters have a much more hesitant relation to technology than the United States does, because it got us through World War II and helped us get to the moon shortly after or before others and that kind of a thing. So Americans tend to have this neutral or positive view of technology, but Europeans have a different view of the matter because they see it as all having the tendency of Babel to leave this arena with its sorrows and create by our own powers a way to evade the cursed banishment of Genesis 3. Even though people wouldn't speak in those terms necessarily, they still see it as a secular Messiah. So I think that's what's going on, is in a culture surrounded by all sorts of neat tools and things, the sense that what we're really missing is God is almost implausible. Lewis's sane suit, that what we're really missing is not the newest iteration of an iPhone. What we're missing is communion with the God in whose image we were made. That's what we were made for. Luther called us priest creatures because he said we're the only ones who can produce or hear music, which is true, by the way, neurologically. Other creatures can't process interval. And without interval, you can't process harmony or melody. So why would God give that to one creature? Luther says because our highest privilege is to sing praise to God, right? And so he gives us the ability to do so. You don't even have to learn to play saxophone or cello. You can do it with the larynx that you have as a child at birth if you're healthy. And so that's what we were made to do, is to adore God and to bask in His presence. So when the culture moves in a more secular direction, I would guess Milton becomes implausible. But when it moves in a more technological development direction, also Milton becomes implausible, because the Edenic state in his poetry is very non-technologized yet. Right? It's a very, very simple idealized depiction of nature yielding her bounty to the blessedness of the human, with precious little in the way of technology to harvest it. Some technologies, of course, are necessary, but I really think technology is the secular God. So it's what will save us from all of our ills. Many people really believe that. We don't have a cure for this yet. We don't have a solution for that yet. But when we get one, it'll be something we made that will solve it. I would think if you lived in Hiroshima in 1944 or 45, you'd have a different view of technology, right? But if you didn't live there, you still will tend to think that that's our mechanical savior, our mechanical Messiah. But those cultural changes, there's lots going on with them. But at a minimum, yeah, secularism does it, and the Industrial Revolution does it. Before the Industrial Revolution, you have a largely agrarian culture. Afterwards, you have a largely urban culture. Every farmer knows if God doesn't bless and send rain, he has no crops. And Now you can run wells 500 feet deep in Colorado and eventually tap into the aquifer down underneath the river, even when the river's dry. And you can pump it up and still spray your crops. Those of us who are more than 50 years old, if we recall the first couple times we flew to California from the East Coast, or from here, the central part of the culture, when you flew over Las Vegas, you could hardly see it out of an airplane. It was so small. And now it's miles and miles, square miles of artificially watered grass. And at night, it's like a sea of light out there now. So we think we can create cities in a desert. Now, there's all sorts of problems in the aquifer when you do that. And when they get droughts like this year, it creates enormous problems for contiguous states. But we think if we can do a thing, we're going to do it. And that's our secular Messiah. We'll fix everything. Well, Jeff, I think they are hankering for escape. So if you have instructions, please give them to them.